I think for much of the public consciousness, AI has really rocketed to prominence in 2023, and there's a real sense of, how did we suddenly get to this moment where everyone is talking about the role it might play in our society and our politics. And one thing that's really helpful, I find, that Fen does in his research is historicizes both the technologies and their social and political uses. And so, Fen, I wanted to see if you could begin by telling us something about this work that you are doing, looking at the history of computation and American politics and what that tells us about these issues of AI and democracy.
Right now, what I want to talk about and give you a bit of context is this term I like using called the new magic. And so what is the new magic? Where does it come from? And why does learning about the new magic help us understand this history of artificial intelligence? I think this present moment in particular. So as we've heard, the promise of artificial intelligence in many ways is that what it's going to do is match people with messages better. And this is this long connection between the idea that once campaigns know people better, they'll be able to craft more sophisticated messages. And so this idea of the AI campaign, where you will have targeted advertising delivered up with specially crafted messages, seems to be a hallmark of our contemporary anxiety about artificial intelligence. But how do campaigns know who to target? And particularly, how is that history of micro-targeting relevant for today's discussions of artificial intelligence? And to me, I think it's a really important part to unlock a very long history of the micro-targeting project in America and in Canada as well, which has been premised on this same claim for generations, that with the ability of better knowing people, campaigns will be able to craft more sophisticated messaging. And you can date this very precisely to the rise of a company called the Claritas Corporation, which had its heyday in the early 1980s. So this is actually a screenshot from Campaigns and Elections, the first and most influential campaign magazine, talking about the new magic. And Jonathan Robin, who was one of the co-founders of the Claritas Corporation, popularized on the first inaugural issue of Campaigns and Elections this ability of using computers in sophisticated ways to pinpoint and know people individually and be able to offer up what he liked to call the new magic. And this was also behind the heyday of early micro-targeting, with firms like Targeting Insights offering solutions to candidates to use this very same targeting services. So what was the new magic? What the Claritas Corporation promised to do was be able to use sophisticated computational analysis to match voter demographics to particular areas or zones across the United States. So this is one of their clusters, and they would cluster America in different terms and terminologies. And so this is one of the prominence of one cluster across the United States. So this seems, I think, very foundational to artificial intelligence today, this promise of using data and computers to be able to make and know certain populations. And it's important to say that this same type of clustering technology exists in Canada as well as the United States. In fact, you can see this actually helped popularize the book. Oh yeah, the blur my background won't let me. Clustering of America. But one of the things which is important is that this same technology is actually used in Canada as well, where the Canadian population is aggregated by computers and put into targetable clusters. And this is actually behind the PRISM system that Environic now sells in Canada. So it's important to say there's this long history here. But what's actually behind it? So this is an unreleased report from 1972 from the Claritas Corporation outlining their methodologies. And really what the clustering system was an integration of census data and postal codes, taking census demographics to be able to isolate certain types of populations and match them to zip codes. And in fact, this kind of new magic, in actuality, is a relatively simple trick of aggregating existing public records, which is the longstanding comment about actually what is the kind of data behind much of the kind of AI and data-driven campaigning of today. But what's particularly interesting is that the biases built in and baked into the system, I think, resonate with our concerns presently about artificial intelligence. When we're talking about census data, it's well known in the United States that census data typically did not account for Black Americans, and in particular, zip codes often did not work on the many reservations, and for Indigenous populations, especially in Canada, where they don't have a fixed address, there's no way to be legible in the system. So what's actually, I think, quite important here is that unpacking these histories, we can understand the particular ways that not only are kind of structural biases baked in or rebaked into data, but also these claims to be speaking on behalf of all Canadians or all Americans, and to say that they're offering up these clusters is actually revealing kind of deeper issues within the way that data is representing and creating a representation of our democracy. And I think that that's actually part of what I think is really important about my project when I'm working on, is trying to understand how we distinguish this kind of these hallucinations or what we're able to accomplish with data from the realities they might hold. And I think that that's actually part of why I've focused on this historical work, is that so much of the moment we have now is that there's a constant production of offering up new magic and offering up new magic, whether that's generative AI or micro-targeting. And it's really in trying to attend to this long history, we can see what are the claims that are actually new and what are the claims that are actually perpetuating an ideal or a dream. And if anyone's interested, this is part of the book project I'm working on now called Voter Machine World. And if you want to hear more specifically about the Claritas Corporation, because I'm being brief about my comments about them, I encourage you to check out my paper about this. So that's, I think, the start for me is really trying to unpack this kind of moment in history. Hopefully that's a helpful beginning, but looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fen. And certainly that is one of the potential uses of AI systems in elections and democracy more broadly, which is taking data about populations, trying to match them up with guesses about what those populations believe or how they might be persuaded, and then targeting messages that way. That's one possible use. And Elizabeth, I want to ask you a question based on this report that you've done and the work you've been doing, looking at how AI systems might be used in the Canadian political context now or in the near future. What kind of things are you seeing?
I'll start off by saying Fen is actually also contributing to that report. So thank you to Fen on that. So there's a bunch of different cases that we outline in the report. I'm going to pull out 3 as some kind of varied examples right now. So one is a chat bot that Elections Markham created. They created this virtual assistant back in September 2022. And the idea was you could go to their website and chat with this virtual assistant to figure out when you have to go vote, where you go vote, information related to E-Day, right? And that we now kind of think of as a pretty simple form of automation. We might not even place that kind of chatbot in the AI category, but only a couple of years ago, that was a pretty advanced version of AI when it comes to what citizens were actually interacting with. Then we've got another example from Advanced Symbolics Inc. And so they have a bot called Polly, and their tool, Polly, has been around since 2015. And they take the same sort of polling and prediction that Fen was just talking about, but they take a different approach. Rather than using data that's been collected and put into databases through census or other kinds of surveys, they scrape the web for information about what people might be thinking or feeling on different political issues. And they use machine learning processes and sentiment analysis on that data they've scraped from the web to try and infer who they are likely to want to vote for, whether or not they're likely to vote, what issues they care about. And so they use that tool to try and predict elections with some success. But of course, the problem with that kind of approach is that not everybody gets counted in those approaches, and not everybody gets to voice their views knowing they're in fact voicing views. And so there's a lot of ethical considerations, I think, at play with that type of use of machine learning. And then the last one I want to point out is the spokesbot from the Alberta Party. So some of you may remember back in January 2023, there was an election in Alberta. The Alberta Party doesn't have any seats, but created a video saying, hey, there's another party. There's another party that you could vote for. The thing is, they used an avatar to do this. So they used a tool called Synthesia, which allows users to feed scripts to any one of 140 different predefined avatars. And then that avatar will say your speech for you. And they initially did not label this as a use of AI. Later, when questioned about it in the media, they were like, our goal is innovation. Our goal is generating discussion, which, to be fair, they did. But it raises questions about disinformation and confusion and trust. And so I think these three examples I've just offered all clearly point to opportunities, but also risks and challenges when it comes to how AI is going to be embedded into our campaigns and into our political practices.
Yeah, thanks. I'll get back to that issue of disinformation and trust in a second, but maybe just to step back and think about this term AI or artificial intelligence. Fen, as you were talking, it struck me that, sometimes AI is again positioned as the new magic. It's, some describe it as the kind of algorithmic work that always seems a little bit more advanced than what people are expecting, and therefore we apply this term artificial intelligence when there really is no clear bright line between that and some of the things that have been done before. So I'm wondering, how you think about using this term and whether we might be giving the technologies or the corporations that create them too much credit.
Artificial intelligence, I think, is quite a loaded word these days because it carries with it a lot of assumptions that the technology itself is thinking or knows, and it's kind of one of these debates that you could spend lots of time in a philosophy class over. But I think that there is a lot of work that we want to be conscious of as scholars into saying that we're not overextending or giving too much credit for what this technology is doing. And also for some of the moments, I think particularly ChatGPT in particular, it seems the fact that it works is a surprise to everybody. And that's, I think, really quite a significant turn. So I think we do want to be mindful about artificial intelligence and think of it as much as a marketing concept in ways as it is an actual term to try to demonstrate a class of technologies. And that's part of what we have to work through, is trying to navigate that hype with, I think, a lot of really important realities that we're facing right now. I'm not diminishing the challenges here, but I'm not also trying to say that I don't need to be a spokesperson for OpenAI.
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, I certainly agree with what Fen you just said. And I think I would even push this farther. Not only is what counts as AI evolving as technology evolves and as our understanding of technology evolves, but I think one of the risks of thinking about this as artificial intelligence is it suggests that there's this independence, that there's this agency that these tools have, and therefore there's this lack of ability to control them or to hold accountable the people who create them. And the reality is every single one of these tools has human input. Every single one of these tools is the result of a lot of different decisions that people are making. And I really want to push against this tendency to take the humanity out of AI, because really it is deeply a human construct.
Right. So turning to this question about disinformation, and I think this one in particular has gained a lot of attention with this, real rise of generative AI models, both video and imagery and language models. And I was doing a quick review of some of the articles I read over the year about the use, the use of what are sometimes called deep fake technologies in elections or other kind of political scenarios. There is a video of, and this is a faked video of the British Labour Party leader mistreating his staff. There is a sex tape of a Turkish election candidate. There was several different types of videos made about the Ukrainian President Zelensky, one of which in which he was appeared to be seen surrendering to Russia. So we're seeing these sorts of things being created, and they're out there. And a lot of policymakers, as well as citizens, are quite concerned about that. And policymakers I've talked to in Ottawa, this is a real kind of top of mind issue, both that people could become misinformed by these, but also that they might be used in ways that contribute to political polarization. So are those legitimate concerns, or how are you thinking about that issue?
Definitely they're legitimate concerns. We know that disinformation spreads much faster than boring factual information. We know that there are also lots of attempts to debunk, and the tools to identify when generative AI has been used are being developed and are being shared. So I think we're in a period where there's a lack of knowledge that means we're a bit slow to catch when these things happen, which gives them power. But I also think it's important to imagine the ways that generative AI could be used to help democracy, right? We could imagine these tools being used to help reach populations that wouldn't otherwise be reached because they have very specific language or cultural norms that a politician or somebody else doesn't know how to speak. And so then they're able to connect with them. Of course, there's plenty of examples of politicians pretending they know languages they don't. Fen actually just last week sent me an article about the mayor of New York City robocalling Spanish-speaking voters in Spanish, even though he does not, in fact, speak Spanish. And that kind of misleading approach is really problematic. And I think beyond confusing people on the particular facts, it risks undermining trust in democratic institutions, trust in different political actors. And so I think really what we need to be thinking about is, how do these tools get used in ways that aren't going to undermine that trust, or that are going to allow people to have confidence in what they're seeing, or at least figure out what it is they're seeing. And so transparency comes in here, development of more tools and literacy around how these tools work, I think, is essential.
Ben?
I just want to add, I guess, I think I agree with Elizabeth in all points. And I think the Eric Adams case is one that I think is a really important moment, because in one sense, it echoes exactly what Elizabeth is saying, is that this is a chance to connect with voters in their language and overcome barriers of participation in elections. And certainly being able to communicate in your native language is in a way that's appealing or compelling, could be a great move in towards making democracies more inclusive. But without doing it transparently, it's deeply problematic. And the fact that it's been rolled out is even more like disturbing, because it just happened far quicker than expected. So I think that the two things that really raises for me is that, one, to me, the generative AI moment is really a continuation of the social media and the platform moment, where we saw a deliberate business strategy of releasing products early, gaining mass adoption, and really leading with change, and then expecting a reaction or a policy reaction. I think we already knew from the kind of platform era that had tremendously problematic consequences, and these companies were not equipped to deal with them. And here we are back at the same square one moment, where you saw the release of ChatGPT and many of the other tools directly to the public without really having in place any mechanisms of recourse for the public impact of that. And right now we're in a moment where many of the models have been leaked or are at least public online, and that there's actually no way of addressing that. But there's no watermarking or anything in place. So in one sense, there's a need for corporate accountability about how this is rolled out. Really, I think the kind of consequences of letting a business strategy lead over a kind of sound social policy. The second is also, I want to just echo that part of what's going on here is that this is not malicious usage, but part of what generative AI is being positioned is connected to an advertising-driven internet economy, which is really trying to promise up this idea of targeting people, and that generative AI is seen to offer more personalized experiences. And that's a deep product and promise of a lot of platform companies that are pushing generative AI. And I think that that's really an assumption that societally we really want to start calling into question is what is the consequences of this idea of personalization that generative AI promises, and how much generative AI is really connected to broader political economic forces in online advertising.
You know, that Eric Adams case that you were both mentioning brings a couple thoughts to mind. We just had a discussion previous to this one in which questions about the potential authenticity of communication by individuals was talked about in both being at risk and, you know, something that remains of great value. And in that case, it's interesting because, as you say, it's a positive development for an elected representative to be able to speak in a way that's more comprehensible to their, to in that case, his income, to the constituents. But then if it's not his voice, if it's not really him, this additional layer of distrust comes in. So there's kind of like deep anxieties about whether not only if we know something is true, but where it's coming from. And that brings me to the second thing, which is both of you have done this work previously on political bots. And again, we're talking, you know, about just before this era of concern about interference in elections, let's say, on platforms, and the use of these tools by some actors in order to flood spaces or give the appearance of individuals supporting some opinions when in fact they may not have been legitimate people behind them. So I guess tell me what either you are thinking both about this like broader building on that concern about bots that we don't really ever know whether we're encountering authentic people, and then also the kind of development of these as tools for including political strategists and others in order to make use and to kind of to very strategically leverage the appearance of authentic communication when it might not be there.
I think it's actually just important to put in context. One of the things that Elizabeth and I got to collaborate on was some of the first research on political bots in Canada. And it was really, and I think I'll echo Elizabeth, correct me here, but like part of what we were trying to do is not fearmonger about bots. And I think your work has really showcased just the helpful uses of bots and trying to put up a spectrum here. So I think that's the same approach that we're starting to take with generative AI, is not trying to be all doom and gloom about what's taking place. But I think it's somewhat harder to be given the way that just the nature of the technology is a bit different and who's behind it. But I think one of the parts that really came up is that when we were talking about bots, we were saying that there would be need or would be beneficial to have some forms of transparency, kind of like what Twitter had done. We're putting in a bot account or trying to help it so that good faith actors can actually signal when they're being generative. And you know, now really with a lot of these technologies, because there isn't any watermarking in place that really enables the outputs to be known or identifiable, we're really at a point where that slim problematic part about the kind of impersonation facet of the bot landscape is kind of blown up and quite more significant in the sense that it's much easier and there's much less recourses to detect this. And I think that was one of the real tensions, at least for me, in the final times we were working on the bot research, is I think there was a real hope to have a bot detector that would seamlessly detect bots and not like a modern day Voight-Kampff tool, and it's not out there. It wasn't out there, and so I think that always left me with a really kind of unsettling issue, is that it led to using stereotypes as a way of detecting who was an authentic or inauthentic political actor. And so I think that actually is where there's an erosion or a deeper erosion of trust, because you're just so suspicious all the time and you're just falling back on these heuristics to check things that it has an almost worse effect, because you don't know what to trust and you're very cynical. And I think that is something that generative AI didn't start, but it's certainly compounded.
To build off that, it's actually a little bit ironic. I think that generative AI is going to weirdly make it a bit easier to detect those bots that we had been studying back since 2015, because those ones, what was difficult to identify was when they were acting kind of like humans. But with generative AI, if you are feeding ChatGPT prompts to then get your bot to say, there's actually good tools for identifying when your Twitter bot has been fed content from ChatGPT. But that doesn't solve the problems of this wider idea of what do we trust, how do we trust it, what cues do we use to identify what is reliable, credible, trustworthy, whatever thing matters to us when we're deciding what information to take on board. And I think the uncomfortable reality is we're at a point in time where we are, as a society, going through a shift. We're reevaluating what trust looks like. And for a while, that looked like the conversations of, are facts and evidence things that matter anymore? And now we've pushed beyond that conversation. And now we're saying, we're looking to this idea of authenticity and this sense of trustworthiness because you are a real human being. And being a real human being is now the thing that makes it enough for us to say that your information should pass through the gates, and not necessarily that you've got expertise and evidence to back you up. Not that we don't want expertise and evidence, but that's just not the marker we're aiming for anymore. And I think that it's going to continue to shift. I think we're going to need to develop new ways of existing in an information ecosystem that includes generative AI. I think we are going to have to kind of struggle through that process, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And I fear, similar to Fen, a lot of people are going to kind of pull away, particularly from politics and political issues, because there's too much out there and it's too difficult to figure that out. I hope, though, we will also come to some sort of new balance.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on one thing, when Elizabeth is speaking, it really struck me is that, like, one of the things that came up in the bot research and one of the parts, at least in the platform research, is concern about the idea that media literacy was going to be a huge catch-all for all this. Is that if you do your own due diligence, or if you develop your own bot detection tool, techniques at home, you're going to be able to deal with this. I think that actually is, really compounding this moment around generative AI, is that we know that media literacy isn't the catch-all. And I don't have a great answer of what's next around that. I think that that's part of where there really is a need to say that the solution isn't going to be for people to detect this themselves. Because I think that we already are seeing and hearing, and I've heard all kinds of rumors about, spam calls that are cloning voices and becoming more effective in robocalling. We know that's a huge, huge issue. And we also know that in general, people can just check out. And so I think part of the risk here is that if it's such a toxic information environment, I think that that's already what we're seeing in the kind of end of social media right now, then those kind of connections, that willingness to participate, is going to become less and less part of your everyday life. And that's a deeper question, but I think that's part of what's at stake here.
Yeah. There can be narrow ground between the credulity, which we're worried about, and the cynicism, which we're worried about in this kind of information environment. Fen, a lot of your work has been looking at what are the policy responses here in Canada to, I guess, AI technologies more broadly, but in particular, perhaps their use in politics. So do you want to kind of give us a sense of where you're seeing things are at and explain the policy landscape at the moment?
Yeah, I'm super excited for this question. This is like what I'm here for, is that I really want to just remind everybody in the audience this incredible time to care and be involved. Is that right now before the House, we have a bill called C-27, which is an addendum item called ADA, which is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And both of these are bringing forward profound reforms to privacy. And this is probably the one very big moment where a lot of regulatory change can happen. So if you care, contact your MP with concerns, because this is clearly a moment when there is a time to act. There's two particular ways. Is that one of the things that has been a long-standing issue about Canada's data and privacy law is that political parties are not subject to any rules and are not subject to PIPEDA and are not going to be subject to the CPPA, which is its replacement. And that, to me, is a very, very simple fix. For anybody out in BC, you're actually quite lucky because your provincial privacy laws actually hold provincial parties accountable to so that we know actually what BC political parties are doing. And as a researcher, I just want to say how invaluable it's been. It's not as though we're seeing kind of crazy, data breaches. It just leads to a certain degree of due diligence and for different insights into what's taking place. That's really important. I think really important to build trust. And it also, I think, helps normalize what's taking place. So the first thing that you can do is contact your MP to say that political parties should be subject to the CPPA. It's an immediate fix and is one that, if you're concerned at all about this panel, is going to really connect the dots, because you're saying that any of the artificial intelligence stuff we're talking about, parties themselves are going to be accountable for it too. The second one is that there is a bill called the Artificial Intelligence Data Act, or ADA, which is right now part of C27, which is being debated. ADA has a lot of debates. There's a lot of controversy around it and the way it's been rolled out, but it doesn't really address any of the potential malicious usage for manipulation. It really focuses on an individual harms framework, and it doesn't actually build in protections for democracy and for public trust. And so ADA is a very nascent bill. It's kind of been described as skeletal. And the second thing that you can do is call your MPs or raise awareness about demands to make ADA more robust and build in a stronger digital rights framework. And those are things we can do right now. Now, there's another discussion around generative AI that's taking place at the federal government. And that's really about whether we can build in guardrails. And I think the thing for me is that it's really important to get the privacy law and the data rights law and ADA in place before we're worrying more broadly about generative AI, because I think you can see in other jurisdictions like the EU, they've actually been saying that these large language models are actually a form of kind of a high risk use because there's no guardrails for how they're being deployed. And I actually think that there's a better way of integrating these types of conversations within the existing law right now. But all I'll say is this is a really important moment for these types of discussions, and one to pay attention to, because right now C27 is that committee.
Great. Well, those are some pretty clear instructions to us. Thank you, Fen. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the audience and online about what we should think about on the policy frontier. So please do add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll get to them right away here. I'm going to ask one last question now, which is kind of a sum up question and maybe a little bit of an unfair one, but it is the title of this panel. So tell me where are you at in terms of can democracy survive AI?
Right now, I'm like, can democracy survive humans? Like, really? So can democracy survive AI? That is completely up to us. It's completely up to how we use these tools, how we choose to develop these tools, how we regulate these tools, how we think about integrating these tools into our information environments. Historically, we haven't been great at doing that with other technologies, and we've seen a lot of challenges to democracy in the last few years through technology. And that's not because of the technology, that's because of how we as humans have been choosing to use those tools. One thing that I want to kind of add in is time and time again, we see when we don't get tech policy and data privacy policies right, we end up further marginalizing groups that are already disadvantaged in society. And so I think the question needs to be not just can democracy survive AI, but can the kind of democracy that is equitable and inclusive and not discriminatory be generated through the use of AI? And that's what I am more interested in. And I don't know what the answer is. I think it depends a lot more on people than it does on the tool itself, though.
Mm-hmm. Very much a good news, bad news take there, if it's up to us. Fen, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think Elizabeth gets to a really important point, is that, at least in my own work, we've seen so much of our sense of democracy associated with technology. And I think, if there is some hard questions we want to ask ourselves, if we give up technology to have as much agency and try to say, like, well, yeah, what are the consequences of our own stewardship of democracy and how well that's going? With the topic of AI in particular, and the kind of high and low maybe we're talking about here, I think really if you're looking at the tragedy that's unfolding um, in Israel and Palestine, there's certainly the way that malicious actors are using generative AI to undermine trust is making a bad information environment worse. And so I really have doubts about our future of media habits. And I don't think that's caused by generative AI, but I think it's participating in a real a gap there. I think that the what it might be as the high is that some of this chatbot work at least might help us think about information literacy differently and enable different ways people of accessing and gaining political knowledge. But that's going to take, I think, really going to take good faith public institutions. And at the end of the day, for me, I think that there's a lot for public media to do, and I don't think the CBC thinks of itself in this mandate of doing that type of work, but I would encourage us to think about where and what are the sources that are going to be building AI technologies that are going to advance the public interest and public good.
There was some conversation about how AI is not one thing, it's more than just chat GPT. But we're right now as a society really obsessing about generative AI specifically, and a lot of fear and fear mongering, as was said. So I'm wondering, is that fear, or the sort of the volume of fear we're seeing now around this one form of AI, actually in proportion to like the specific dangers of this AI versus all the other AI that we already live with, where we've seen so much less fear and conversation as a society?
The history of like panic over the introduction of new technology is long, and I'm sure Fen could speak to that more examples than I can. The particular aspects of generative AI that I think make it primed for this kind of panic in a way that other types of AI haven't, are how relatable it is and how easy it is for us to use the generative AI tools that have been developed. And they've been developed that way on purpose. They've been developed that way so that we will use them and play with them and be able to connect with them, because that's what makes money. Yes, it also creates fear, but it also makes a lot of money. And the kinds of AI that we don't know about, some of them are relatively benign because they are so far being used in ways that we find really helpful, or that we don't even know about. That's how embedded they are into our lives. And some of those, which seem benign right now, might not when used in a slightly different way or by different actors. So I think the idea of trying to determine which types of AI are more or less worthy of panic is a little bit too difficult to do. I think what we could be doing is thinking about which types of AI do we need to better understand. And I would actually say that generative AI isn't the one that we need to better understand right now, although better understanding of it is going to be helpful. I think there's a whole bunch of kinds of AI that are embedded into all kinds of tools that we use that we don't know about. And there's AI being developed intentionally in a way that it is black boxy, so intentionally that we will not be able to understand it. And I think those are the ones we need to spend a lot of time thinking about and try and develop policy responses that prevent too much of that black box effect from happening.
We have a request for an example of a black box.
Oh, so a black box is essentially when the technology gets made and then input goes in and something happens and then input that something comes out of it. So an example here is, for a long time, social media platforms have described content moderation processes as necessarily black boxy. They use these automated tools, these AI tools, machine learning tools to do something with the content that gets posted, and then some of it gets deprioritized, some of it doesn't. Some of it gets taken down, some of it doesn't. And then we've seen through pushback, platforms now have to be a lot clearer about how that moderation works and when they're using those tools. But to a certain extent, there is still a lack of knowledge about what rules they're programming in to their automated processes.
Yeah, thank you. And do you have anything else to add on this question about how much we should be concerned about generative AI as one species of this larger category?
I just want to talk about a particular Canadian flavor of AI doomerism. I think that there's been a lot of efforts to equate the rise of ChatGPT with existential risks for the future of humanity, which hasn't happened in a lot of other technologies. And that seems to be something that's a particular Canadian take on it. And so I do think it's important to be mindful that a lot of the claims that are being discussed around AI and the way that it poses the kind of calls to pause all AI experiments and some of this talk about the kind of high risks of AI I think are ones where it's not helpful and not helping the conversation. I think also contributes some panic that, if anything, is trying to accelerate or undermine actually think due diligence in the democratic process around AI regulation.
With the spread of AI, especially like what I'm thinking of is how do we mitigate the biases, or at least acknowledge the biases that are coded into AI by itself, like from its inception?
I think that's a deep. I mean, that's a huge question. I totally agree. It's a tough one now because I think there's in one sense, there's a really good movement towards data sheets for data sets that was trying to acknowledge as a critical practice in AI developers, how to get better at making sure you have clean data and you're aware of the biases. And I think, I want to recognize the work that was being done around that about, best practices around AI developers. And that, so all I say is there are conversations that are really about mitigating bias and being aware of the bias in the data set in the field. That kind of got blown out of the water with the generative AI stuff, which effectively hoovered up all of the internet. And it's funny because I was reading about people reverse engineering the prompts. And so much of actually what the generative AI systems are doing now is that they include, when you type in something, a number of prompts that go along with it to be don't do these discriminatory things that you might do where you're not told to do. And so what we really have is basically our solution right now is hey, generate a picture of a dog, and then OpenAI just puts on top of that, make sure that there are a number of different ways so that it doesn't reproduce the biases that are baked into it. So it's a really challenging moment because I think what we're being proposed is a certain form of artificial intelligence in the large language models that eschews these kind of best practices that were being developed around bias and tries to fix it in post, which I think is really, a real, part of, I think, why we want to problematize this moment in particular is that it's going against the good work that's happening before it. So I don't know how necessarily you're going to de-bias these large language models, given the fact that it seems pretty, a collected all type mentality. And so it just merely reflects back the biases of our society, which I think is a really, part of the kind of problematic politics of the technology itself.
If I could build on that, I was part of a team through the assembly project at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center a few years back, and we talked about what we called positionality aware machine learning, and our argument was, in a lot of the machine learning and AI discussions, the answer to the bias problem is add more rows of data, add more examples. If you have enough data fed into your system, eventually you are going to solve the problem. And that gets to what Fen's just been saying of, right, you then just more accurately reflect all of the discriminatory systematic problems within our society. And so what we argued was machine learning and AI tools need to be developed with particular positionality from the get-go. We argued that it's a columns problem in a data set, that we need to be thinking about what categories are and aren't included and why, and that tools shouldn't be built to be the be-all, end-all. We shouldn't want the most general possible machine learning model. We shouldn't want the most general possible AI tool. We should want tools that have been specifically designed for particular contexts and that have been designed with the people who are going to be impacted by them in mind. And that's very resource intensive and is not something that VC funders are interested in backing. But I think there's a lot to be learned there from this idea of thinking about the context in which those tools are going to be used and designing for those contexts in order to try and mitigate this very well documented tendency towards reinforcing systematic bias.